Hello and welcome. We're the Lost Boys. I'm Tandy, and this is Harlan. Say hi, Harlan.
Hi, Harlan.
And today we are continuing our set review of Chapter 2, Rise of the Floodborn from Disney's Lorcana. In today's video, we'll be talking about the color Emerald. Emerald is traditionally, at least in Chapter 1, constructed very much about questing for high amounts of lore and having characters that have punishes when you try to challenge them, or protection like Ward. And I think that we're going to have a lot more of that today.
Yeah, it seems like we're getting a little more depth. I'm hoping that we can find enough cards that we can really start having some competitive Emerald decks where, you know, with Chapter 1, they existed, but they weren't, you know, top contenders, and I'd like that to change.
Yeah. So what we're going to do, we're going to be starting with the most expensive cards in the set in terms of ink value. That way we can discuss the shifts before we discuss the smaller iterations of the things we're going to be shifting on. I felt like in their previous videos we were talking about the little ones for a little too long, and then when we got to the big ones, we're like, we already talked about that. So without further ado, we'll begin with Cheshire Cat from the Shadows. 8 cost inkable, 5/6 with evasive and shift 5. It quests for 2. And with the ability Wicked Smile, you can exert it to banish chosen damaged character. What do you think, Harlan?
Yeah, so this is really interesting because we've already had a, you know, popular Cheshire Cat at 3 cost that, you know, always kind of needed something to push it over the edge. I think this is close, but I think this missed the mark a little bit. I think this needed to be maybe a little smaller in a shift 4 so you could curve right into it. Just because, you know, the Cheshire Cat, if you have to take a turn off after playing it and not quest with it to be able to shift, you know, that's too much of a tempo loss usually. And, you know, this isn't quite enough payoff, and then it costs 8 normally, so it's just too big of a downside for me when I'm not shifting it.
No, I completely agree. It seems like a very awesome design. You know, I love the ability to banish characters that have a little bit of damage on them. Maybe it pairs well with things out of steel that deal 1 damage to a bunch of things. And perhaps we see some Cheshire Cats in the future that are much more geared towards being something like Emerald Steel, and this could fit nicely as a big shift target at the end of the day. But yeah, 8 cost, evasive, quest for 2, large body, 5/6, so quite strong as far as like a card is concerned, but maybe just not a home for it just yet. And we'll have to see how things play out. Next up, 7 cost Dr. Facilier, the Fortune Teller. This is a 7 cost inkable 4/4 with evasive, another big evasive character, and it quests for 3. And the ability, You're in my world. Whenever this character quests, chosen opposing character can't quest during their next turn. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so this card is really strong. I think it may get sat on a bit by Mother Gothel from Chapter 1. But, you know, we might run into some situations where we may have like an Emerald Sapphire ramp deck where you actually just want more of those type of effects. And then in that case, this has a lot of room to shine because it is larger. It quests for 3 and has evasive, so it's a lot harder to deal with out of a lot of those decks. And yeah, I think this card is probably going to be on the back burner for a long time, but it's definitely a good one to keep in mind as, you know, a way to solve some problems.
Yeah, one thing I want to discuss in terms of this type of an effect, it's like it's preventing your opponent from progressing towards their end game, and we've seen a couple cards that do this, but we also see cards that say your opponents can't challenge and they can only quest, which is a direct opposite. But the way that it affects the game is more so you just get to control how your opponent uses their characters, and I just like that the fact that it's able to do that while being evasive, and it quests for quite a bit, and it has 4 willpower, so it does dodge things like Smash and some of the new steel effects that destroy things that have 3 willpower. So very cool card, Dr. Facilier, Fortune Teller. Next up, probably one of the best 5 cards in the set, maybe the best card in the set. We're going to be discussing Beast Relentless. Beast Relentless is a 6 cost inkable 4/5 that quests for 2 and has the ability Second Wind. Whenever an opposing character is damaged, you may ready this character. So long story short, you play Grab Your Sword, it gets to ready. It can even sing Grab Your Sword and then ready itself immediately after. If you send a bunch of your goons in to challenge your opponent's stuff, every time that they attack, you get to ready the beast and quest again. There's no limit on how many times you can quest with this card, which makes it very scary in terms of lore generation.
Yeah, absolutely. This card so far has not been as gangbuster as I thought it would. You know, you having to ready with it after playing it the turn previous is kind of a big challenge, especially now with 2 chapters out where all the decks are, you know, a little more you could say like turboed. You know, every deck is a lot more powerful.
Yeah.
I think this card would be absolutely busted if it had shift, but you know, I think it might be a little more just adequately balanced. But you know, I'm still deep in the lab on making this card as good as it can be.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also some things you can pair with it that can give it rush so that it can perhaps tack down multiple characters on the same turn that you play it. Something like White Rabbit's Pocket Watch to give it a little more utility outside of the questing for a bunch of times in a row. Overall, though, yeah, I mean, it's a 6-drop that doesn't do anything immediately when it enters play. So it has a high barrier to pass. Next up, we're going to be talking about Little John, Loyal Friend. This is a 6-cost, 6/6 inkable, very large, and a quest for 2. Pretty generic stats, but very, very large considering the cost.
Yeah, definitely like a fine role player in some decks that just need stats at a high point on the curve, but not really going to see a ton of play.
All right. Next up, we're going to look at Verana, Fang Chief. This 5-cost inkable, 5/5, quest for 2. Another kind of vanilla thing that can kind of fill out your curve, maybe unlimited.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely more of a limited card. You know, we've always joked with even the best of the 5-drops in Emerald that, you know, there's just a billion 5-drops in Emerald, and this is maybe one of the worst ones. So.
Okay, moving on. We're going to continue looking at some of these, I guess, weaker 5-drops. These are mostly for limited play. This is Tiana, True Princess, 5-cost inkable, 5/3. Another character, the quest for 3, though.
Yeah, and this one's also a princess, so it combos with the 5-cost Amber Moana. That is pretty interesting. But, you know, outside of some niche synergies like that, I think it's going to be on the back burner also.
Yeah, you know, it's just decently statted, no abilities, classic.
Yep.
But I think that the thing you pointed out, the princess thing, you know, the subtypes of these characters, Floodborn, Storyborn, Princess, Villain, these are not things we've explored too much with yet. There's references to them on some cards, but it is not widespread yet. But so it's just going to be like these cards will get better over time because there will be synergies put into play.
Yeah, I think that's going to be something to really, really keep your eye on as we get into like chapters 6 through 10 or so. You know, once we start getting a lot of those effects, or maybe we have a chapter that's themed around a specific, you know, princesses versus queens or villains versus heroes, where, you know, we might start getting a lot more cards that care about that stuff. But for right now, you know, it's, again, just kind of file it away in the back of your mind and come back to it when you need it.
All right, next up is Ray, Easygoing Firefly. This is another 5-cost inkable. It's a 3/3, the quest for 3, and it has evasive. Does this tilt the needle any way for you?
Yeah, this one kind of hits all the boxes. You know, it's missing that 4th point of willpower that I would really like to see to survive things like Smash. Although Smash is seeing a lot less play now with some of the new cards from Steel. So, you know, that 3rd point might be good enough.
Right.
This one being inkable and the 3 points plus the evasive, definitely I have it, you know, in my mind prevalently, and we'll definitely be making some decks.
Do you think it's maybe better than Mad Hatter in that slot, or maybe one of the new 5-drops that people are talking more about, like the Bell Archer that we're going to get to?
Yeah, so I think it's right in the mix with those two. I think Cusco is still number 1, and then, you know, then you start running into, okay, I want more of these. Do I want that 4th point of willpower? Do I want the evasive? Do I want the extra power level from Bell and give up the inkable? But this card is absolutely in that conversation basically all the time.
All right, next up, Pete, Bad Guy. This is a 5-cost inkable, 3/4. Importantly, has that 4th point of willpower, but it also has Ward, quest for 2, and it has 2 different abilities. Take that! Whenever you play an action, this character gets +2 strength. Who's next? While this character has 7 strength or more, quests for +2, so quests for 4. What do you think about Pete?
This card is sweet. I haven't found anything that really, you know, excels with it, but this card plus the 4-cost Minnie Mouse in Ruby that has shift, I think there potentially could be a sweet action based, kind of combo deck.
Mm-hmm.
But, it hasn't really panned out yet. And I think that's definitely something to keep an eye on as we get, more chapters or as we find more synergies as we get deeper into the card pool.
Do you think that this is something that can work well with support to maybe put support on the map? I know that the 5-cost queen that we talked about in Amber, being able to pump P bad guy seems like a really nice way to meld Amber and Emerald together, which you don't see that often.
Yeah, it is. That is definitely a way you could do it. That is a bit of a struggle just because while Amber is known for having songs, it's not especially known for having other actions, especially cheap ones.
Sure.
So it's going to be pretty hard to turn your Pete on when you don't have specifically that queen.
Sure.
Although Maximus does it from the large supporter from Amber, but that's 2 5-drops pairing together, so it might just be too much tension there right now. I think Pete definitely fits really well in with Ruby because you get the additional payoffs plus some cheap actions. And then it also pairs really well with Sapphire because Sapphire has multiple, what we call cantrips that are 1-cost actions that draw a card. And then you also have, Alice that we'll get to later that gives all your stuff support to pump this. So that's definitely a more natural home, I think. But, like you pointed out, it works really well with Queen. And in the future, Amber might have some more of those cheap actions too.
All right, moving on, we have the Uninkables at 5 in Emerald. First up, we're going to look at Lucifer Cunning Cat. There's a 5-cost 2/2, so a very small body. It quests for 2 and has the ability Mouse Catcher. When you play this character, each opponent chooses and discards either 2 cards or 1 action card. This is actually the first time I've seen this card so far. What do you think about Lucifer?
I think this card would maybe be too good at Inkable. And it's one of those cards that kind of is a casualty of it being uninkable. I think this card is just going to be too hard pressed to fit into decks with its meager stats. 2/2 for a 5-drop is not great. And the discard 2 is pretty strong, but then all the cases where they do have an action, you just, get kind of hosed for your investment. I think there's a lot of little things that could have made this card a lot stronger, but it's
maybe making this card stronger makes everyone else miserable though, right? Like if you turn the dial too much, like if it was just a straight up 5-cost 2/2 that made your opponent discard 2 flat, I mean, maybe you start to get into territory where you get to play that with You Have Forgotten Me, maybe some of the discard payoffs that they put in this set that we'll get to in a few. And it starts to look like, the ravenous rats or whatever, just chewing up your hand. It starts to look really, really, really gross. But no, I agree. 2/2 body makes it probably not good enough. Next up is Bell Hidden Archer. This is one of the marquee cards in the set. When they first previewed it, everyone was going bananas over it. It's a 5-cost uninkable 3/3 that quests for 3, so very similar to Kuzco. Shifts for 3, so you can play it on a smaller bell. And the ability Thorny Arrow says when this character is challenged, the challenging character's player discards all cards in their hand. Has anything changed since the initial release of this card?
Not too much. It is, still very much fighting Kuzco for slots in the aggressive Emerald decks. It kind of is a bit worse than Kuzco because, guaranteed removing their pressure with the Kuzco keeps you more tempo positive, where this is, a lot of times it threatens to be a bigger effect. You might get 2 or 3 cards from your opponent, but a lot of times, the game plays out where they'll just play a lot of their hand and then challenge the bell, lose maybe 2 cards and be ahead on the board, where the Kuzco is way better at managing the board while pressuring your opponent. I think, it really depends on what the metagame looks like, and Kuzco is definitely the favorite right now. But Bell is always going to be that, number 1.5 or 2 right behind Kuzco.
All right, next up, we're going to be moving on to the 4 drops. We have Pack Tactics, a 4-cost actions inkable. It says gain 1 lore for each damaged character an opponent has in play. This is a weird one.
Yeah, this card's sweet. I think it is really not going to see a ton of play just because the matchups where it's going to be really good are like go wide matchups, right? But then then we're going to be trying to get a bunch of damage across a bunch of their characters, and the best way to do that is something like Grab Your Sword or Tinkerbell Giant Fairy. But against the go wide decks, their cards are cheap. That's how they go wide, and then they're small, so they usually just die to those effects.
Yeah.
So then you can't actually draw the cards because they're not in play anymore. This card, where it would come up the most powerfully would be like a matchup where you both are playing to the board in large quantities with bigger characters, and you just get to, assemble some damage on their characters and then play this for 3 or 4 cards, which would be great. But, then you're just walking into if your opponent has Rapunzel and things like that.
Yeah, I think this card's really cool. It's, a emerald action that can gain lore, which doesn't exist until now. And this is pretty sweet, but it is difficult to turn on. I would maybe like to see this in a deck that has a bunch of like 1 and 2 drops that when you quest with them, they're kind of throwaway, but they affect your opponent in some really important ways. Flynn Ryder, 2-drop, for example, your opponent challenges it, they have to discard a card, and so it's basically putting 1 damage on their thing at the price of 2 lore and a card from the opponent. That type of an effect over and over again might leave your opponent with something like 2 or 3 damaged characters on them, and then all of a sudden Pack Tactics becomes burn you out at the end of the game, maybe. But it's hard to like leave characters on your opponent's side of the table and expect to be able to win the game. And that's just the way the cookie crumbles. So
yeah, I think another thing holding this back, like you're talking about that strategic plan, is that I think inherently already, not even with people having this play pattern on their radar, is that they're kind of, all right, this is my character that's going to do most of my challenging, and then these characters are my questers to race my opponent. There aren't really that many characters that are doing both all the time, especially in large quantities, where you're going to be spreading damage on your own characters, chip-shotting their thing and then questing with the other thing. It's really going to be like a Maui's a great example of just he does the challenging, and then you have other things that do the questing. Mm-hmm. And once you've seen this card from your opponent, that's absolutely how you will be playing to mitigate that card in the first place.
Yeah, agreed. All right, next up, 4-cost Inkable, 4/1 quest for 2. This is Radigan. Radigan, Criminal Mastermind, has evasive. This thing seems pretty dicey.
Yeah, I think it's going to ultimately not take up a large metagame share just because of that 1 point of willpower. It's just too easy to lose it for basically no value on your 4-cost thing. Not to mention, like, 4-cost Inkable 2-point quest or evasive is not something we're struggling for. Mm-hmm. Really, in any deck, there's several colors that have access to that, and then you can just play the other ones that aren't as fragile. There is maybe a world where that 4 point of strength is really necessary on the defensive and there's not much steel running around. But, as we've seen, steel is always going to be present.
Yeah, I mean, cards are just good. Dealing 2 damage to everything, and it's permanent damage. Pretty good. All right, next up, Flynn Ryder, his own biggest fan. There's a 4-cost 2/3 that quests for 4, kind of. Has Shift 2, which is pretty sick, if you ask me. It also has Evasive, which is awesome. And the ability, One Last Big Score. And it says this character gets -1 lore for each card in your opponent's hand. So it only quests for 4 if your opponent is empty-handed, but it's very cheap, and it works really nicely with all of the discard synergies that we've seen so far.
Yeah, I think this card is an interesting payoff for those discard decks. Not to mention it has shift, so you can kind of get in on a key turn where they are empty-handed, where you can like play a discard spell or 2 and then shift this out to get the 4 points right away, which is really cool because then your opponent's like drawing empty-handed, and then they have to answer this thing that has evasive with basically the top card of their deck, which is pretty interesting. The problem being that like the discard effects aren't totally there yet, but it's pretty close. It's definitely a good card to keep an eye on.
Yeah, it does combo really nicely with another card that we'll get to in a minute, and I'll make sure to bring back up Flynn Ryder, his own biggest fan, when we do. Next up, we're going to be moving on to one of my favorite cards in the set. This is Donald Duck, the Perfect Gentleman. 4 cost inkable, 2/5, the quest for 2. It also has shift for 3, and there's quite a few Donald Ducks around, and I know that there's going to be quite a few more because he's a fan favorite. And the ability, allow me, at the start of your turn, each player may draw a card. And so you get access to the card first, which is a huge deal. It has 5 willpower. And if your opponent is dead with 5 cards in hand, it doesn't really matter what his ability does. But if you can translate your extra cards into lore generation at like a 2-for-1 basis, like 1 card equals 2 lore, then I think that you're just going to outpace your opponent quite easily. And the 5 willpower actually makes this pretty difficult to deal with.
Yeah, it's funny. There's also another layer of synergy here for this card. In those discard decks that we were talking about just previously, this is a way to keep your opponent with the card on your turn
Sure.
to get your payoffs for your discard effects. You know, on my turn, I ready with Donald Duck. My opponent draws a card when they had none left, and now I can still use a discard effect and get my benefit off of something that does benefit me for making my opponent discard a card.
Yeah, I absolutely love this Donald Duck. I think that I'm going to be playing it a bunch. Next up is Daisy Duck, Secret Agent, 4 cost inkable, 2/3, quest for 2, and has the ability Thwart. Whenever this character quests, each opponent chooses and discards a card. So kind of similar to the Donald Duck in terms of spot on the curve, but fundamentally opposite in what it's trying to do.
Yeah, I think this card is pretty sweet. I think it's actually going to see a reasonable amount of play because it's inkable. And, you know, there are a lot of matchups where this type of effect is really strong, like against, say, like a more mid-rangey Ruby deck that isn't really playing characters to the board, but is trying to Dragonfire you. You know, you play this out on the play, you're going to get that quest in, and then it doesn't really matter because you're trying to play a longer game where you're draining their resources. And if you ever get to quest with this a second time, it's, you know, very strong. It also has some game against some aggressive decks where if they don't have a 3-point strength character, they're going to have to a 3 willpower character. They're going to have to trade off for this after it's quested. And getting that extra resource against a lot of these aggro decks is beneficial while you're also, you know, kind of racing them a bit. The stats might hold it back in the end, but you know, I'm pretty interested in this card overall.
No, me too. I think the one thing that you do need to discuss with this card is pairing it with bodyguards. Like, obviously, the size of it's really weak, but we don't see too much Amber Emerald in general, and maybe there's enough cards, enough reason to play them together. And it doesn't even have to be Amber, right? Even Steel has a couple bodyguards with like Hercules and the new Prince, and those types of things could really make it difficult for your opponent to punch through and deal with this Daisy Duck Secret Agent before it quests twice. And questing once feels like pretty disheartening if you don't deal with it immediately, and questing the second time, like, the game just starts to spiral out of control. Even if you're ignoring it completely and just like questing and doing your own thing, you know, this is going to strip away the last few cards you have. And outside of the like Steel Amber decks that play Stitch Rockstar and the Wheel 7, Whole New World, this thing seems like it's going to be pretty backbreaking. I don't know. We'll see. All right, next we have Arthur, Trained Swordsman, 4 cost, inkable, 4/3, quest for 2, no abilities.
Yeah, limited all-star potentially. Not gonna see a ton of constructed play though.
No, I agree. Next up, Radigan's Marvelous Trap. This is a 3 cost item with the ability Snap, Boom, Twang. Banish this item. Each opponent loses 2 lore. So in actuality, this is kind of like gaining life. We're removing some of our opponent's ability to win the game, but that's essentially just elongating the game. I don't really see this doing too much, but it's certainly a cool ability.
Yeah, I think this card has potential in the future when maybe we get like an item engine that lets you recur an item every turn. And then this is a good way to keep your opponent from being able to close the door on you because, you know, a good strong engine that does a recursive thing is a really good way to win really long games. But one of the issues with, maybe not issues, but one of the things that happens in Lorcana is that once your opponent, as an aggressive deck, gets to a high lore count, it can be really hard to stop them from being able to close the door.
Right.
And this is the type of thing that, like, if you're recurring this marvelous trap, that's an easy way to put your opponent out of being able to close the game completely.
Yes. We've seen, Aladdin Heroic Outlaw come down, eat stuff, gain 2 lore, but also stealing 2 lore from the opponent, and it just feels like the game becomes unwinnable at some times. And if it, like you said, if they do make some things that do bring that back from your discard pile over and over again, I mean, how do you physically win the game other than disrupting the engine itself, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Next up, Ring the Bell, a 3-cost action that is inkable, and it says a banish chosen damaged character. Overall, I would say a fairly weak effect, but it doesn't exist yet, so this is kind of cool.
Yeah, I think I could actually see a world where this sees some play, especially in like Rapunzel decks or things that really struggle to, like, Emerald doesn't have a way to really just remove a character, right? It's always been return your character to your hand. And then that is a tempo positive play, but is not actually resource positive, where this actually can be resource positive. And especially if you're playing a bunch of cards like Rapunzel gifted with healing, you kind of want to have these high willpower, low strength characters anyway. And then you can just send one in, put a damage on their character, ring the bell on it, and then set up your Rapunzel gifted with healing for later. That is a pretty strong recipe to me, and this card being inkable makes that easy to facilitate doing.
All right, next up, we're going to talk about Hypnotize. This is another action. This costs 3 and is inkable. It says each opponent chooses and discards a card, draw a card. So you discard one, I draw one. What do you think?
If the discard deck is good, it will probably play some of these. But this is a really high rate for this type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
3 ink is a lot to be spending to not impact the board whatsoever. And that's an easy way to fall very behind very quickly. So this card could be a role player, but I would proceed with caution on this one.
Yeah, I think one of the big strengths of You Have Forgotten Me is that it takes 2 cards at once. And so you can kind of wait until your opponent gets down to 2 cards in hand before you strip them of them. And that often is the 2 most expensive and best cards in their deck or just in their draw. Whereas Hypnotize, it kind of functions similarly in card economy where it's a 2-for-1, but I just don't think making your opponent discard 1 card is that relevant in most game scenarios, and especially so on turn 3. Like, your opponent just usually has a big uninkable or just an expensive thing that's going to get put in the inkwell next turn. And yes, you are getting that 2-for-1 advantage, but like you said, you're not interacting with the board. And if they're slightly aggressive or heavily aggressive, cards like Hypnotize are just going right into the inkwell.
Yeah, and one thing about You Have Forgotten Me is that a lot of times it does end up being tempo positive in that, I paid 4 resources on a pretty late turn in the game, turn 8 or 9, and I played something else that turn also. And then on your turn, when you go to your turn 8 or 9, you're drawing a card. That card is very unlikely to cost 7, 8, 9, right? So you're going to be playing something that's cheaper. So you're not using all those resources anyway. So you actually gained tempo where I, played like a 5-drop or whatever with my You Have Forgotten Me, and then you played whatever you drew, which is probably going to cost 5 or less.
True. Next up, this is another action, but it's a song. It's Bibid Bobby Boo from old Cinderella. This is a 3-cost, not inkable action song, and it says return chosen character of yours to your hand to play another character with the same cost or less for free. How do you see this card impacting? Are there any combos you've seen so far with people playing this?
Nothing that really stands out to me so far. The card has potential. I think what it really runs into is all of the good when you play this effects on characters that are maybe not aggressively costed, but competitively costed are usually uninkable. Like your Genie on the Jobs, Hades Infernal Schemers, things like that are all uninkable, and those are the cards you really want to be using this with. That they come into play and they have come into play effect that impacts the board, so you're swapping those out. The problem is you just run out of uninkables very quickly. And, that's like the ultimate kind of deck building requirement for Lorcana is where do you hit that number? And I think that's really what's going to hold this back long term, where I do think this card would probably be a little too good at inkable.
So one thing that kind of intrigues me about it is that, you kind of think of this card in one way, but it really functions in another, where the way that it feels like it works is I return my 5-drop damaged character to my hand, and that allows me to play something like Maui, hero to all, to come down and challenge my opponent's thing. But in actuality, what's going to end up happening more often than not, I think, is that you get to essentially blink the character that you are targeting with Bibid Bobby Boo. And it might be this thing with a bunch of damage on it, but it also might just be something that has like a really cool interplay effect. I like that it's a song, and so it also works in Amber Emerald again with the 1-cost Cinderella that can sing 3 drops. And so if you don't have that many uninkables, this might actually fit into a deck that wants to draw a bunch of cards with like Carefree Surfer, for example, might be something that can pair nicely with this. But it's a lot to ask, and it is one of those cards that's going to do absolutely nothing until it does something really cool. Next up is the Queen Disguised Peddler. This is a 3-cost version of the Queen that is not inkable. It's a 2/3 with the ability a Perfect Disguise. It exerts to choose and discard a card and gain lore equal to the discarded character's lore. So this is the card we were talking about that works with the Flynn Ryder that quests for 4. Flynn Ryder, his own biggest fan. We got confirmation from the rules team, and they said that discarding Flynn, his own biggest fan, at any point with the Queen Disguised Peddler does gain you 4 lore. So that's a nice little 1-2 punch.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty strong combo. I also think the most ideal way to be building decks with this card in mind is playing like the big characters, like Mickey Mouse Brave Little Tailor, for instance. That just has 4 points of lore. And, you're not necessarily trying to play those characters. You're just trying to discard them to the Queen. Mm-hmm. I do think this card is probably going to be held back a little bit by the fact that it actually has no lore on its own.
Yes.
I think giving this like 1 point of lore probably would have been super fine and still would have made sense, thematically. Where like
also considering it's also uninkable, right? Like
yeah, exactly. Like I feel like this card they were a little too scared of. And to be fair, as we get more cards,
yeah. They might be reasonably scared for a good reason. Like they might have tweaked the numbers quite a bit and came up with this one, I think.
Yeah, quite possibly. But yeah, it is weird to have a card that has no lore that doesn't have Reckless. We haven't had that before. Mm-hmm. But this is a card that I don't think is going to be like competitively there right now. But in the future, this is always a card that you can come back to and be like, oh, we got, another 5-point lore quester. Like, is this card absurd now? And maybe it is.
All right, next up, this is Prince John, Greediest of All, 3 costs, not inkable, 1/2, very, very small body. Quest for 2, and has ward, so it's not going to get blasted by Fire the Cannons. The ability is called I Sentence You. When your opponent discards 1 or more cards, you may draw a card for each card discarded. So this is one of those payoffs we were talking about for discarding, but it doesn't actually add anything to the board. And so you're just doing more of the same thing where you're just accumulating raw resources in hand, reducing your opponent's amount of raw resources, but it's not a very big body, so it doesn't quest very well. It doesn't challenge at all. And honestly, I'm not a huge fan of this one.
Yeah, I think this card's really sweet, and I think, there might be enough of the stuff here to be doing the thing with Prince John, but like is
that a technical term? Doing the thing?
Yeah, that's the professional terminology for sure. Yeah, so like we can definitely do all the stuff. The problem is a lot of it is what I call tempo negative, where you're going to be falling behind on board, and that was pretty okay in Chapter 1. Where, there weren't all that many decks playing to the board, and you kind of saw that with Ruby Amethyst Control being good for a long time with Magic Mirror, was there weren't all that many good ways to impact the board that didn't just get cleaned up by Be Prepared. But now, it's a different world. We have 2 sets out, and it's a lot easier to play to the board and do it effectively through a bunch of these cards. And in that kind of world, these tempo negative cards like Prince John and the discard spells are a lot worse.
All right, next up, we're going to do 2 cards together. We're going to do Panic and Pain. These are 2 characters from Hercules. Panic, Underworld Imp, is a 3-cost uninkable 2/3, the quest for 2. The ability says, I can handle it. When you play this character, chosen character gets +2 strength. If the chosen character is named Pain, it gets +4 strength instead. Pretty medium card overall. Not inkable is a huge downside, but the pairing it with Pain Underworld Imp, this is a 2-cost inkable 1/4, the quest for 1, and the ability says, come in, your most lugubriousness. While this character has 5 strength or more, he gets +2 lore. So together in tandem, these actually might be pretty good. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a really sweet combo. I think they made one of them uninkable just to make sure it wasn't just always present in all the green decks. I think it is pretty sweet. I think Panic is kind of like a lateral move on Meg that we've talked about a lot on previous episodes. The Emerald 2 drop from Chapter 1.
Right.
We know that ability is pretty good, and while this is uninkable, it is on a bit better of a body. That second point of lore is huge. The extra 2 willpower is huge. And if I don't think you can just shoehorn the 2 of these together into a deck and really want to be doing that. But, if you have like the Queen or a 4-point support character to pair with your Pain, that's pretty strong.
Another reason to play Amber and Emerald together.
Yeah, that's true. I am concerned just about how many of the Emerald cards are like, yeah, these are sweet cards that interact really favorably with this absolutely busted Amber card. Maybe we should just play a busted Amber deck.
Yeah, that's fair. All right.
But, it is sweet. And this, Pain is a way to turn your support cards into additional questing threat versus just challenge threat, which is unique and strong. And Pain or Panic, like we talked about, isn't that bad on rate. So, I might actually be pretty intrigued about this in, Emerald Amber with, the Queen and maybe Maximus, or in, Emerald Sapphire. Who knows?
Sure. All right, next up we have Donald Duck Sleepwalker, 3-cost 05, the quest for 1. It's inkable. The ability is Startled Awake. When you play an action, this character gets +2 strength this turn. What do you think?
I think this card's kind of bad.
Me too.
Yeah, it
takes a lot to get going, and even when you get it going, it's not that good. So
yeah, and it just has no defensive capability whatsoever. Like even if you like really go off and get to kill something really big, it's going to die on the backswing for free because it has 0 strength. It also doesn't have any real lore threat to it.
Right.
Yeah, I think this card's just kind of bad.
Next up, Bell Bookworm. So this is a potential shift target for the 5-cost Bell. This is a 3-cost uninkable 2/4, the quest for 1. And the ability, use your imagination. While an opponent has no cards in their hand, this character gets +2 lore generation. Thoughts?
I do think it's weird that, this is the second Bell we have in the game, that her ability is like, if you're already winning the game, you win harder.
Yeah, maybe it's just more about if you're winning the game, you close more quickly.
Yeah, I that is a good way to look at it, and also really how it does play. This card is really sweet. I do think it is kind of annoying that the discard deck, like thematically, is kind of tempo negative, and then they gave like all the payoffs, the uninkables versus like the enablers.
Yeah. Also, all of the payoffs are just not very strong, like on strength and willpower.
Yeah.
So, there's no way you can like challenge your opponent's stuff. There's no way that like you can quest and be unhindered in your questing. I don't know. Until they show me some big reason to play all these discard effects, I'm just gonna pass, I think.
Yeah, I think the thing that really kills me is that like all the enablers, the things that make your opponent discard, those are the inkable ones.
Yeah.
That like are the ones you can't really get rid of because you need to play those to turn on the uninkables. So like some amount of the time you're going to be inking your enablers, and then you're going to have to play your payoff because it was uninkable, but you haven't enabled it because you inked all your enablers. I think this deck could pop off if we ever get like a steel card that's like whenever your opponent discards a card, deal a damage to something. That might be too good with Whole New World. You know, your opponent discards 5 cards, you spread 5 damage around and get 7 cards in your hand. It's kind of ridiculous, but that's kind of what I think these decks need, because you need to be able to impact the board while doing your thing.
All right, next up, we're moving to the 2 drops. This is Bounce, 2 cost, uninkable action, not a song. It says return a chosen character of yours to your hand to return another chosen character to their player's hand. So bounce my thing, bounce your thing, or bounce 2 of my things if you really want to. You did play this in one of our versus matches, and what do you think of it in general?
I absolutely love this card and these types of effects. I think this card is ultimately going to be held back by it being uninkable.
Same.
There's just too much tension for such a situational card where whenever I'm playing uninkables, they need to be like insanely high impact, like Whole New World or Grab Your Sword, or a character where they don't really have like a fail rate. Where a card like this that's so situational, I can't rely on the situation even coming up for me to be forced to hold this in my hand. Yeah. Where, you know, whenever it's an inkable and it's a situational card, that's totally fine, because then I can just ink it when it's bad.
Next up, Queen of Hearts, Quick Tempered, 2 cost, uninkable, 1/2, quest for 2, pretty good stats. When you play this character, deal 1 damage to chosen damaged opposing character with that Royal Rage. Pretty interesting design. I mean, we've seen 2 cost characters that quest for 2, and they're usually pretty weak on stats. This one has the ability to maybe finish off something that already challenged you once. I really wish it would just deal a damage to anything, but that doesn't seem like Green's forte.
Yeah,
Emerald, excuse me.
Yeah, no, you're good. I think Emerald, has that. It's weird because they only deal damage to things that are damaged, but they're not good at dealing that first point.
Yes, that's the big thing.
Yeah, I think this is unfortunately kind of, I just mentioned that uninkable characters usually are a little bit safer, but even when they're situational, because they can still be a character. But, this card, it doesn't have the oomph behind it.
Yeah.
I do think there are some metagames where this is a pretty strong card, or if later on we get to add like sideboards to our decks, this card definitely can shine there, where there are a lot of Ruby cards that we're going to get to in that review that deal damage to your own stuff when you play the card, and this card is a really good way to like clean up that type of stuff, to punish your opponent for doing that type of thing. But I think it's just too niche of a scenario to be playing this as an uninkable.
Next, we have Gaston, Scheming Suitor, 2 cost, inkable, 1/3, quest for 1, with the ability, yes, I'm intimidating. While 1 or more opponents have no cards in their hand, this character gets +3 strength.
Juice isn't worth the squeeze on this one.
2 cost, 1/3 is like this. 2 cost, 1/3 is like close. It's like close. But that ability is
maybe
just
if it was
like,
a 2/3 that got +2. But yeah, even in my discard decks, I don't think I would play this.
Yeah. Next up, Enchantress, Unexpected Judge. This is a 2 cost, inkable, 1/1, small stats, quest for 2, big deal. Ability is True Form. While being challenged, this character gets +2 strength. So while it's questing, it's like trading up for your opponent's larger characters. This one might actually be pretty good.
Yeah, so I think this one is definitely going to be metagame dependent on, if Steel is really popular, that might hold this back a little bit, just because it is inkable, so against a Steel deck, you can just ink it. But you can't, like, always be planning to do that. Yeah. But if Steel exists in the metagame and isn't super popular, that's a totally fine plan. And then the next thing you're going to have to look for is, are there a bunch of things with 4 willpower getting played? Because those get to clean this up for free, where if there's a bunch of stuff that's 3 willpower and lower, I'm totally fine trading this. I got my 2 points of lore and, affected the board in a tempo positive way. This is a card that I'm whenever I'm playing aggressive Emerald decks, this is always going to be on my radar and usually making the cut for the deck.
No, I agree. I think it's one of those cards because it's inkable. It actually is just always going to be great because if your opponent's playing steel, you just ink it, play something else. Next up, we're moving on to another version of Cheshire Cat. This one's Cheshire Cat, always grinning. 2 cost, inkable, 3/2. So pretty large stats for a 2-drop and a quest for 1. No abilities though, but that is a shift target for the 8 cost Cheshire Cat that we saw earlier. I think this one's solid. Don't know if it'll see much play, but maybe.
Yeah, I think this card's actually going to be pretty popular as like a 2-of in most Emerald decks, just because a lot of Emerald decks are pretty, they're usually aggressively slanted, but you do have to win games on the draw in like an aggressive mirror match. And this is a really good card for breaking parity on a Simba Protective Cup.
Yes.
That, Emerald struggles with normally. So this is a good way to have an answer to that in your deck that, when those situations come up, you can play it. And outside of that, it's inkable and not just a complete dead draw in the later game.
Next up is maybe one of my favorite Emerald cards in the game. This is Bucky Squeak Tutor, or Bucky Squirrel Squeak Tutor, 2 cost inkable, 1/1, very small. Has a quest for 1, and it has ward, so your opponent has trouble targeting it. And has the ability Squeak. Whenever you play a Floodborn character, each opponent chooses and discards a card. If there were something to enable the discard stuff, Bucky is going to be it. And now it's just a question of how many good Floodborn characters can we play alongside Bucky? And then on top of that, how many things can we play that are payoffs for the discard effect, like your opponent having no cards in hand? Thoughts on this one?
I think this card is really sweet. Some of the best art in the set for me, for sure. I think it's just such a slap in the face that the Prince John that they gave us is like the ideal curve of like Bucky into Prince John, and the Prince John is Dreamborn, not Floodborn.
Yeah. I wish there were a bigger signifier on the cards to tell you that they were Dreamborn, Storyborn, Floodborn. I feel like it's not an afterthought, but at some point I think they will highlight it better so that you can see those synergies more clearly. And I'm hoping that Bucky gets some help in the next few sets because as a card, I think this one's just scary. If it were Floodborn itself and the second copy of Bucky on turn 3 started your opponent discarding cards, it would be incredible. But at this point, I think you just got to figure out, what are the best Floodborn characters to pair with it, and do you have enough time in enough matchups? But the fact that it's inkable means, again, if your opponent is hyper aggressive, amber, steel, aggro, or something very similar, just ink it. Put in the ink well. All right, we're getting down to nitty gritty. The 1-drops, we have 2 left. This is Improvise, 1 cost action that is inkable, and it says chosen character gets +1 strength this turn, draw a card, so it replaces itself.
Yeah, I think this card is going to see a lot more play than it should. People love to spend, a resource to draw a card. It does have some upside with a card like Pete, Bad Guy, where, this gets you 3/4 of the way there for him getting the additional lore. So then you only need a static +1 from something, or maybe like a 1-point supporter, something like that. It is kind of annoying that it doesn't get you all the way there on the 1 action, so you still have to jump through another hoop. But I think it's going to see a lot of play. I don't think it's a very powerful card.
Yeah, I'm hoping it just pairs with the Minnie Mouse that procs with it, and there's a couple cards that'll trigger off of it, and it cycles. So I think it might have a spot just because it replaces itself, and it's an action that draws a card. So we'll see though. Lastly, the last card for today's video, we're going to be doing Flynn Ryder, Confident Vagabond. This is a 1 cost inkable 1/3, the quest for 1. We only have 2 others of these in the game so far, right? We have Minnie Mouse and Olaf, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So this kind of fits alongside that kind of vein where, you might want to use it as an early quester, but when you start pairing it with things that can buff it, like Megara, or I can't remember if it was Panic or Pain, but I think it was Panic. But you can use that to turn Flynn Ryder into like a real threat, and with 3 willpower, it's usually going to survive against the opposing 1 and 2 cost characters.
Yeah, I think we may have moved away from that kind of theory development now, especially with the new Queen 1-drop being out. Amber is always going to be a popular presence in the metagame. The cards are just so strong, and you need to have the counterplay on their 1-drops because all of their goons are good shift targets.
Yes.
So I think we're actually back to aggressive decks need to be playing.
Good theory. Yes.
Yep. You need to be able to actually proactively trade versus reactively trade.
Yes.
You aren't necessarily the beatdown, even though your deck is the aggressive deck. Their card threatens the board and the game more than your card, so you actually need to be threatening to remove theirs versus them needing to remove yours.
All right, I feel that. All right, before we go, I want to say thank you to our sponsor, Games and Comics Paradise. Games and Comics Paradise is a store out of Fairfax, Virginia that specializes in trading card games like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, Magic the Gathering, and now Disney's Lorcana. So make sure to check out their website at gcparadise.com for all of your TCG needs. We really appreciate them. For Harlan, I'm Tandy, and this has been our set review for Emerald from Chapter 2, Rise of the Floodborn, and Disney's Lorcana. Later this week, we will be continuing our exploration of the other colors, so make sure to hit the like and subscribe button at the bottom of the channel and keep up with what we have coming out here in the near future. Thank you so much, Harlan, for hanging out today, and I guess we'll just say bye, Harlan.
Bye, Harlan.